Hello, and welcome back to this series of video lectures on environmental assessment. As we've mentioned previously, the business environment consists of three parts: the economy, markets served by a firm, and the firm's industry. We've talked about economic impacts on firms' performance potentials in part one of this series. And in part two, we talked about market and the analysis of markets. Markets are comprised of the communities of buyers. Industries are communities of suppliers. And so in this third lecture, we're going to talk about the community of suppliers to markets and the community in which our firm exists. And we're going to take a two-pronged approach to this review. In the first part, I'll go over a number of analytic models that are used by strategic planners and strategic analysts. Some, but not all of those models are in your textbook. And then we'll take a look at some individual industries and how they recently have been performing and the kind of issues that arise when we look at those industries individually. And from time to time, we'll be able to ask whether all of the models that we looked at in the first prong are applicable to those industries. And very often, we'll find out that although the models are helpful, they don't tell the entire story. So with that, let me get started and see if I can bring this thing up on the screen and we'll get going. There we are. So here we are in part three, industry analysis. Now, if you are a business analyst working in the strategic planning department of a corporation, what kind of questions might you ask when you begin to analyze an industry? Well, of course, we'd like to know what the growth potential of the industry is, and we'd like to know how many competitors there are, whether they're all about the same size or the industry's fragmented. Perhaps it's concentrated in just a couple or more evenly dispersed. Perhaps there are groups of firms in the industry that share certain characteristics. For example, in the pharmaceutical industry, some firms offer generic drugs, and their strategic emphasis is on production at low cost, whereas other firms specialize in research and development, and they incur very high cost in order to develop unique and differentiated products. So how volatile or stable is the industry? Is this an industry where you can do long-range planning, or are things happening so fast, changes occurring so fast, that it's more difficult to do long-range planning? What are the driving forces of change? What sort of things are occurring, perhaps in technology, that make changes in this industry happen? And finally, what are the profit prospects or the profit potential of the industry? And it's with that last question that we can begin looking at the first model that strategists use to assess industries, because the results of this model, the results of using this model are indications of strategic priorities. So it's a very useful model. And this is the famous Porter's 5 forces. This model has been with us for a long time. Porter actually published it in a 1979 issue of the Harvard Business Review, and in a book that he published in 1980, and it's been with us that long. To give you an idea of my age, I read that book and I still have it on my shelf. So in any event, Porter's model and its 5 forces begin with rivalry and the intensity of rivalry. And Porter was able to demonstrate that as rivalry goes up, the rate of return on investment in companies go down. In previous years, I've asked my students to help me demonstrate this, and we obtained published rates of return, average rates of return for various industries, and we plotted them on the scale. And they lined up very neatly. As intensity of rivalry increases, industries' rates of return decrease. So this is the fundamental bedrock of the model. And there are 4 other forces that can modify that bedrock, that basic tendency. The threat of new entrants that come into an industry, because if new entrants do come in, supply goes up, and when the new entrant enters, the demand doesn't immediately go up, and so there's a supply-demand imbalance, and the effect on prices goes down. If there are, if buyers have multiple choices, or if there aren't too many buyers and there are lots of companies in our industry, then they have the bargaining power and they're able to negotiate for lower prices or more costly services, costly for us, costly for our industry. And so again, profit potential of the industry decreases. If suppliers are fewer in number than members of our industry, then they have the advantage, and the chances are that costs will go up and profit potential will go down. And finally, if in other industries, not our industry, but other industries, it's possible for firms to offer our customers the same benefits that we offer, then that has a very significant impact, because among other things, we can't charge prices any higher than they do. These occur in industrial markets. They also occur in consumer markets. Do you want to take an airplane trip to go to a business model, or do you want to use Zoom? Do you want to drink beer or have a glass of wine, and so forth? So substitutes really do enter into the picture as well. All of these 5 forces push profit down, and consequently, Porter's 5 forces model can be used to assess the profit potential of an industry. And if all or most of these forces are strong, it's a pretty good industry not to get into if you're not there already. On the other hand, if most of the forces are weak, then perhaps it's attractive. What if only 1 or 2 are strong? What do we do then, especially if we're already in the industry? And the answer is we form strategy to offset those forces, either to neutralize them or overcome them. So Porter's model can be used both to guide the formation of strategy as well as to assess an industry's profit potential. And that's why it's used so often. This is a list of factors in an industry that can enhance an industry's rivalry. I took this list directly from Porter's book that was published in 1980. His book has lots of lists, checklists, and guides for industry analysts to use. And they've held up pretty well over the years, although from time to time, some of Porter's guidelines have been updated. But this is the original list, and it's still as good today as it was 40 years ago. We've seen that one. So here's an illustration of one way to present a five forces analysis result. And we simply identify whether the forces are low, moderate, or high. And one of the things we note, and by the way, each of these exhibits that I'm showing you now have been taken from PowerPoint slides prepared by my students when they did projects in my classes. But here you've got an industry that has relatively high rivalry and high buyer power. And one of the things that I think you probably can understand pretty quickly is that when rivalry is high, buyer power also tends to be high, because when rivalry is high, we have to compete more for favorable attention from our customers. Here's another way of looking at the five forces results. In this way, it's graphic. And you can see again the idea of rivalry being moderately high and buyer power being very high. In this case, we've got this new element of substitutes that have come in. And you can see that this analysis was done for Cemex, the cement the Mexican cement manufacturer that is a major factor in the global cement industry. This is a way that you can present the results in a table, and it's particularly useful for a couple of reasons. First, you can probably imagine that the highest score on this chart is a 5, and the lowest is a rated 1. But what we can do with Porter's five forces is assess the profit potential of an industry in different countries or different geographic markets. And this can be very helpful when you're doing strategic planning in a multinational corporation. So in this particular case, we can see that the US and China have the highest loadings on Porter's five forces scale. What does that mean? It means that profit potential is lowest in those countries because these forces that push down profit are strongest. Does that mean we stay out of the US and China? Probably not. But what it does mean is that we're going to have to do some real good strategic planning to come up with strategies to offset the strong forces in this industry. And you can see that in both cases, we've got a rating of 4 on rivalry, as opposed to 1 in Mexico, or a 2 in India. So depending upon the loadings on these forces, we can alter our strategy in order to compete more successfully in these different countries, if we elect to do so at all. Now, one of the interesting things that Porter has given us over the years is the concept of strategic groups. But that's not why it's interesting. I think probably other theorists and other strategists would have come up with the same idea. What Porter told us is that the way we can differentiate or distinguish one strategic group from another is that their loadings on the 5 forces will differ. So the group of pharmaceutical companies that makes proprietary drugs has a different set of 5 forces than those that make generic drugs. Now today, if we were looking at the pharmaceutical industry, we'd have to add some other strategic groups. This is a pretty old slide, but today we have the new biopharmaceuticals, and of course we have firms that are engaged in both generic and proprietary, but I think the biopharmaceuticals are a whole new group. So now, let's take a look back at Porter's 5 forces for a moment, and we can see over in the second from the left column the threat of new entrants. One of the benefits of Porter's model is that we usually can figure out how to evaluate these forces, and that's another reason it's been used so much. But when we get around to judging the threat of new entrants, it's a little more difficult. And thankfully, one of Porter's colleagues at the Harvard Business School, a guy named Pankaj Ghemawat, came up with this model, the cage analysis. And it really, in Ghemawat's terms, it was used to measure the, quote, distance between a company's home country and the countries where the firm might be located elsewhere. So what are the difficulties of entering into an industry from another location? And Ghemawat came up with 4 criteria, and he wrote quite a bit about them and this method. But those 4 criteria are culture, administration, geographic distance, and economic. So let's talk about those just for a moment, and then we'll get into them a little bit further. First, culture. Obviously, it's a little more difficult for us to do business as Americans in Japan or China or India, since we don't speak the language, and their methods of supervision, advertising, appealing to customers are all very different because their cultures are different and have long histories that imply certain assumptions that you and I might not even make or know that our customers are making because we haven't grown up there. So cultural differences can be pretty important. Administrative differences have to do with the regulation, paperwork, industry standards, codes in the case of building, but essentially the regulatory environment that we have to deal with when we contemplate moving into a new market. And then there's the matter of geography. Now, certainly the distance between the United States and China is one geographic factor, but we can solve that problem just by locating a business in China or a factory. We don't have to ship things from the US to China. So what else is involved here? And if we talk about India, you get the idea pretty quickly. India's roadways and highways are not well developed. They're often undeveloped. So it's really difficult to transport products in trucks. The transportation systems and the infrastructure in India makes it very difficult for manufacturers to do business there because it's hard to get their products from one location to another, much harder than it is in a well-developed, mature economy like this one. So, and you can see that this example was done for Schindler, a manufacturer of elevators, and the case was done to look at the difficulties that Schindler, a Swiss company, had in moving its operations to India. And then finally, economic. And economic differences are not just, don't deal just with the GDP, but how big the economy is, how fast it's growing, how fragmented it might be, what the GDP per capita is, what the relative consumption potential of the economy is. In India, for instance, it's pretty hard for people to buy new homes because they just can't afford it. The same is true for cars. Later on, we'll see how India's economy resulted in the development of new kinds of new cars. In any event, the cage analysis is very useful in assessing barriers to entry, one of those 5 forces. And so here's a way of expressing the cage analysis and barriers to entry between countries. In this case, we need a reference country that we're basing the comparison or the so-called distance on. And this was this exhibit was back in that case on Cemex, the Mexican cement company. And so the distances for Mexico are 0. Instead, every one of the other lines on this table represents the strength of so-called distances or difficulties in locating business from Mexico to another country. And so over on the right side of this table, the higher the rating, the more difficult it is to transfer a particular business in a particular industry from one location to another. And in this case, you can see that the folks who did this project thought that moving from Mexico to India with cement production would be especially hard and not too much less difficult to get to China. So here again, we have the opportunity to use this tool to assess the difficulty of entering one geographic area from another in a particular industry. One thing I think I should add here is that something else that this analysis can give you is a little bit of an idea of how difficult it will be to grow in an industry, because many of these forces, if they're strong, make it difficult for companies to grow in specific industries. In this model, also given to us by Michael Porter, we're interested in knowing the extent to which a country's economy can support an industry. So the a minute ago, we were looking at the growth potential using the cage analysis to assess an industry's growth potential. Now we have a model that was designed almost specifically for that purpose, to identify what economic conditions support an industry and accordingly its growth. And once again, we can use this, almost have to use this model to assess differences between geographic areas. In any event, the four elements of the diamond model are factor conditions. Think of factor conditions as the recipe for an industry. So it's the factors of production, including not just labor and materials, but also the infrastructure, the availability of power. As we mentioned earlier when we were talking about India, the infrastructure. All of those relate to the recipe, as I call it, for producing products or services in a particular country. Demand conditions are pretty self-explanatory. To what extent is there demand for this product or service, and is it growing? Something else that's really important, and that is the extent to which an industry is supported by relationships with other industries. So the classic example is computer hardware and computer software, video games and the software for video games, and so forth. But related industries, if you're in pharmaceuticals, for instance, you've got the healthcare industry, the pharmaceutical industry itself, the chemical industry, distribution industry, hospitals, and so forth. Construction industries, you may be able to make tractors, but is there a good distribution system? Is there a demand for construction? And so forth. Are there sufficient mechanics to keep the equipment running and enough fuel, and so forth? And finally, Porter put in this term strategy, structure, and rivalry. And back when he published this model, how your firm and other firms competed, the structure of the industry per se, whether it was concentrated or fragmented, were important. But today, the most important word in that block is rivalry. Is there a great deal of rivalry in this industry? Perhaps there's not much at all, or perhaps rivalry is moderate. And where the industry falls in that continuum can make a big difference. We'll deal with that in just a minute. As a matter of fact, let me deal with it right now, because it's usually best to talk about something as soon as it's mentioned. So in the five forces, you may recall that as rivalry went up, the rate of return on investment went down. And I wish I could make this thing do what it's supposed to do. Let's see if I can. There we go. So that's a pretty easy relationship to understand. More difficult is the relationship between rivalry and the health of an industry and its growth potential. And here we see that it's not a linear relationship. When there's no rivalry, there's not much incentive for whichever firm happens to be have the monopoly to improve the quality of its products or services or efficiency, because it doesn't have any competition. As competition enters the picture, chances are that the quality of the industry will also go up, whether it's in the nature of products or services, until it reaches some maximum point. After which, if rivalry continues to increase, it becomes more difficult to work on quality or service or long-range planning because you're constantly in a pitched battle where decisions are momentary rather than long-term. When we get all the way to the end of the rivalry continuum, this means there are lots of companies that are fighting each other like dogs fighting over a scrap of meat in the street. This is a feeding frenzy here. It's a pretty rough world to live in, and the industry is certainly not healthy at this level. So what we learn is that moderate rivalry is the best for industry's health and long-term growth, unlike in the five forces. So now, let's see if I can get down. Here's a way, again, of using a scorecard to represent the results of a five forces analysis. And it looks like what I've got to do here is fix the size of the, there we go. That's a lot better, isn't it? Funny thing happens when we use PowerPoints is that occasionally, for some reason, the print size seems to migrate. Anyway, we can use Porter's diamond to assess the relative attractiveness of an industry and its growth potential. Hold on and let me make this change again. There we go. I don't know why we don't have an average for the US here, but if we were to divide 19 by 4, we'd come up with almost 5, wouldn't we? So maybe 4.75. And so the higher the loading from this model, the more favorable the indications are for an industry's growth and the viability of firms in that industry. And once again, we can use this tool to assess differences between countries. And so when we did this, and I really don't know what industry was being looked at here, but you can see that China looks pretty good as a home for this industry. And one reason we use Porter's diamond is that we can get, if we're in a relatively new industry, and we would like to get the industry and perhaps our firm into fighting condition, to build it up and make it stronger. We'd like to know which country, what location to do that in, because the location gives us the most favorable conditions for getting up and growing. Once we've done that, once we've built our company up and gotten stronger, then we can move into other countries. So Porter's diamond often is used to assess conditions in which a new company can get started in a particular industry before the industry's life cycle develops and we move into other countries. I think I'll just fix this right now. Pardon me. Just take a second. Oh, you know what? It was there already. but for some reason, uh, it wasn't colored. I really don't know why, but now we're fixed. Okay. Um, Another thing that we like to do in industry analysis is assess the industry's life cycle. Uh, so how far along in its lifetime is this industry? And we've got a device for assessing that, and it's the life cycle model. And as you might imagine, the priorities for competition will differ at each stage of the life cycle. So knowing where the industry is in its maturity or its development in its life cycle gives us insight into the kind of strategy that we need to form to be appropriate for conditions, competitive conditions in this industry. If the industry is in its embryonic stage, we're probably looking at a situation where not many customers even know that we exist. Our motives probably are to get our product established before other firms come into the industry, and if they're already there, we want the market, the customers, to accept our standards, the design of our product as the industry standard, because if that can be accomplished, then we'll have greater growth potential and likely profit potential. Not all firms that start out in an industry succeed. It may be that they offer something that the market just does not want. But if the market accepts what the industry is offering, then we have the growth potential and rapid increase in demand for the product. Here, our interest, of course, is maximizing growth, becoming efficient, scale economy, identifying targets of greatest opportunity in the market. What will happen eventually is that we'll approach the maximum potential for this industry. And as we do, weaker companies will fall out because they won't be equipped either based on differentiation or cost or reliability of the product, and they'll fall away. And so whereas there may be lots of companies in the growth stage, by the time the shakeout is done, we won't have as many companies in the mature stage. Another thing that'll happen in the mature stage is that the industry will become more stable for a while. Leaders will emerge, followers also will emerge, and the industry becomes orderly. And it's at this stage that good profits can be made. Now, after the mature stage, it's possible that the industry will decline because some new industry gets started during this industry's mature stage to substitute for what this industry is offering. On the other hand, if the industry happens to be soap or beer, then there may not be a decline. It may be that the industry will simply stay in the mature stage. And of course, if that is the case, then a firm that is a leader in a mature industry that is likely to remain mature, a leader is in a very good position because it can anticipate sustained competitive advantage and earnings. So here are the 5 stages, and I've just discussed them. So I think I'm going to move on, but you're welcome to look at these stages when you review the PowerPoint slides that I've put on your Moodle shell along with this video. So a rather interesting thing occurs in an industry's life cycle, and that is that there's always someone that comes first, and that company is the first mover. Later on, another firm will come into the industry, and then another, and another, and another. And as long as technology doesn't change too much, the first mover, as it works down this curve of the life cycle, will enjoy a cost advantage because it learns about the industry and how to perform the functions of that industry. And so the learning curve and the life cycle curve have a lot in common. However, notice what happens is that eventually we come to the end of the curve. So the first mover's here, the second mover's here, the third mover's here, the fourth mover's here, and all the competitive advantages have been competed away. And so when the industry becomes mature, first mover advantages and the benefits of learning are kind of used up. They're used up because people migrate between companies and learn how other companies do things. Suppliers of machinery and equipment that serve one company provide the most advantaged machinery and equipment to second and third and fourth movers and so forth. So eventually everybody in the industry sort of knows what to do and what others are doing, and competitive advantages are very difficult to achieve. It is possible to get some additional cost reductions through added volume. And the way to get added volume and scale economy is through acquisitions and mergers. And so very often when I found clients down at this level, we sometimes looked for merger partners and acquisitions so that we could enjoy scale economies. Another way to look at the evolution of an industry that I have found to be very helpful, I wrote about in one of my 2 books. We often hear about critical success factors, capabilities, functional capabilities that firms have, that can have, that distinguish winners from losers. The textbooks, sometimes they're called key success factors, but whether critical success factors or key success factors, you can find those in the literature. But those occur, and those are relevant up here in the mature stage, in the shakeout. The question is, how do you get to that point in the first place? And the answer is that there are critical failure factors. They could be flaws. They could be technology that doesn't keep up with state of the art. It simply could be certain functional operating capabilities that the more successful firms have learned how to do. But if you don't have them, or if you have these pitfalls, then those are critical failure factors, and they'll keep you from getting through the shakeout stage. It's only then that you can be a contender for long-term survival in the mature stage. So critical failure factors don't get the kind of attention that I think they should. If you're interested in new industries, new technologies, the emergence of new industrial opportunities, take a look at the critical failure factors as well as critical success factors. What is it that keeps firms from becoming a contender for the big prize? Here's another device that is often used, the BCG matrix, and it's used again to assess industries. It's based upon, and I might add that it is also somewhat related to the industry life cycle. That's because one of the axes in this diagram is the growth rate. And of course, the industry's growth rate is fastest at the growth stage and then slows down in maturity. The other factor is market share. So firms usually start out in the venture stage. They're new businesses. And if they succeed, their market share will go up, and the industry is in that growth stage of the life cycle. Back here, it may be in the embryonic stage and it moves into the growth stage. If your company has a high share of a fast growing market, it's called a star. Now, stars are great, but they consume cash. They don't contribute any cash to the company because they're reinvesting in themselves. On the other hand, as the industry matures and the growth rate slows down, then reinvestment of cash flow into the same business isn't necessary. So we still have the high market share, but growth has subsided. What happens to the profit that is earned by companies in this condition? The answer is that that profit is turned into cash to fund these ventures. Of course, ventures don't always gravitate into stars. They sometimes just don't make it, and then they become dogs, which are companies with low shares of industries that aren't growing very fast. So in this case, the venture started out in an industry that we thought would grow, but the industry didn't grow. After a company becomes a cash cow, if the industry grows old enough, long enough, it may be that we've got we're in an old industry, and the market share suddenly is not as high. It looks like I've got another little problem here. Pardon me just a minute. Let me fix that if I can. There we go. This is something that does happen with PowerPoint. It's sort of frustrating. Whoops. Oh, golly. There we are. So let me move on. What happens if we don't know the market share? Maybe there are so many companies in this industry, or they're so widespread, or they're all held privately, and we just can't get market share. We may or may not be able to get the industry's growth rate, although that we should be able to do, but sometimes we can't get that either. Is there another way that we can look at an industry to get pretty much the same kind of information? Incidentally, what we would like to do with a BCG matrix is to have, let me see if I can grab a little, there we go. Okay, so we'd like to have a nice big business here to provide cash. We'd like to have a few of these guys. They're not as big, they're like that. And uh, we've got several, oh boy, that didn't work out too well, did it? I think I'm just gonna make that go away. So we've got multiple ventures, and then ideally, one of these ventures becomes successful and becomes larger. And if we're lucky, we'll have more than one of these. We'd rather not have too many of these guys down here. But our objective really is to have a few of these ventures, uh, at least one star that can add to the profit, to the growth of profits in the firm, and then a nice, comfortable cash cow to provide more funding. And if we can have this kind of a BCG matrix where we have, and I'll try this one more time and see what happens. Yeah, there we go. I got lucky. So if we've got this sort of thing going on where we've got cash cows, stars, and ventures, then we've got a well-balanced portfolio. And that is, from a cash flow standpoint, that's very much to be desired. Okay, so what if we don't know our market share or our market growth rate? Or even if we do, are there other factors that we would like to look at? By way of example, how is our firm positioned in terms of technology or in a particular geographic region, or perhaps it's respect and acceptability in the government if we're a defense contractor. And then how attractive is the industry? We used market growth as an indication of attractiveness, but industry attractiveness could also be industry profitability. For sure, the pharmaceutical industry, by way of example, is much more profitable than many consumer products companies, many other consumer products companies and industrial products companies. Building components, for instance, have average profit margins of maybe 7 or 8%, whereas, and by that I mean operating profit margin, and the operating profit margin in the pharmaceutical industry is perhaps 20% or more. So industry attractiveness could be simply the industry's ability to accommodate and benefit from and be attracted to the kind of products we make, the kind of services we offer, the kind of new technology that we're developing, the kind of new products that we can develop with our new technology, and so forth. So business position can be popularity of our company, it can be our technology, and so forth. So how attractive or how well positioned our firm is could be measured by market share, but there are a lot of other measures. And the same for the attractiveness of an industry. Could be measured by growth rate, but there are other measures. And depending upon how the combination of measures we choose, we can put together this thing called the GE McKinsey matrix. And based upon where we position or place the products and businesses that our company has, we can make decisions about whether we care to manage them like cash cows or stars and to grow them. So this is another often used matrix because it's so flexible. Okay, remember back in the cage model? Um, the C in the cage model refers to culture. And one of the questions is, how do we assess culture? And here is, there are a number of ways to do that. One method of assessing culture is the use of a profile created by Gert Hofstede. I'm trying to remember where Hofstede was a native, and I'm sorry I can't remember. But he was so successful with this model that the Hofstede Institute was created, and today, in addition to the basic 4 cultural measures that Hofstede developed, we have a 5th one, long-term orientation, and still others. But these are the ones that are used most often to evaluate the dimensions of culture that we can use to distinguish a company and to guide us in our marketing and operating strategy. Power distance is the relationship that people have with each other. If a power distance is strong, it's very unlikely that a subordinate will get very close or very familiar with a superior. There's a strong status among people, offices, stations, and so forth. Lots of stratification. That can really make a big difference in how folks work together and how management methods are devised. And you can see that in Peru, you better not get out of line. And in Ireland, maybe you and your boss can go have a beer. Uncertainty avoidance is the, another way of looking at it is the tendency to avoid risk. And once again, you can see that Portugal came out very high, China came out quite low, Japan came out high. I've always been fascinated by China's rating here because it says that China, in China, people are and managers are willing to take risks. And yet you can see also they have very high power distance. So they're very orderly, and yet they're as for at the business level, willing to take risk. This is unlike Western countries, and Western countries have a very hard time dealing with this difference. Individualism is pretty much self-explanatory. America claims to have rugged to encourage rugged individualism. I don't think that's the case any longer. This table was created back in 1984, and I'm quite sure things have changed since then. The US has moved much more in the direction of European countries. It's tended to be a lot more social, almost socialist. So I doubt that the US would have a rating of 91 in individualism today. China, on the other hand, at the time this table was done, had a rating only of 20. I think it's probably a little higher. Look how low Venezuela was at 12. So if individualism is low, collectivism is high, and you do things by consensus rather than on your own. Masculinity is a misnomer. you can really make a mistake looking at that term. Masculinity and femininity in Hofstede's framework has nothing to do with gender. Masculinity is a metaphor for acquisitiveness, aggressiveness, but especially the desire to own things and hold things. And so you can see that Chile has low masculinity. In other words, there's not as much motivation to own and hold and have things as there is in Japan, for instance. Um, and you can see the United States is not as masculine on this scale as Japan was back when the scale was built. Now, there's one other relatively new dimension of culture that has been posted partly on this chart, and that is long-term orientation. But Japan and China both are long-term planners. They think in terms of the future and what the future consequences of current decisions will be. The US is ranked quite properly here, and I think if anything, its ranking today is probably lower than the 29 on this chart. We tend in this country to make decisions for immediate gratification and immediate results. Our stock market responds to, and our publicly owned companies plan for quarterly earnings releases, that is, reports every 90 days. It's hard to be a long-term thinker when you're operating on that basis. So again, big difference between Chinese and American companies culturally. So at this point, I'm just going to show you some slides that my students made of cultural differences to show you how you might do the same kind of work. In this case, it looks like we're comparing Australia, Brazil, and China on those 5 measures. And based upon and so perhaps the company that this team was interested in had operations in those 3 countries. And here then is a little comparison of several countries based on these 5 dimensions with some comments on the left. And again, when you get a hold of the PowerPoint slides or review this material, you can look at the bullet points. But power distance, you can see that Russia has a very strong sense of status. So does China. By the way, so does India, which is important because India is like China, is a large, growing country. So risk avoidance or uncertain avoidance, you can see Russia again, pretty high on the loading. So is Brazil. Masculinity, which is acquisitiveness. And again, what's kind of interesting is that Russia is low. Now, I didn't mention what the flip side of masculinity is, which is femininity. Feminine cultures, according to Hofstede, are those that place a high value on the group and on the community and keeping the organization intact. So collectivism, doing things together, consensus. If somebody gets out of the fold, exhibits some individualistic tendencies, the group tends to want to bring them back, maybe through criticism or penalties of some sort, or maybe in a more generous way, kind of like Mama Bear, to go get that cub that ran away and bring it back to the lair. So Russia is more that way, more interested in the organization, integrity of the organization. Long-term orientation, rather interesting. The blue bar, the dark blue bar, is the United States. So I think the final basis for comparison that we will look at is country risk analysis. And the underlined line or sentence here is especially important. There are several methods of assessing countries' risk, and there are several organizations that publish country risk analyses. One of those that I look at is the Economist magazine's economic analysis unit, but it's not that. It's got a somewhat different name, but it's a department within the Economist publishing organization that publishes country business risks. That's not what I'm going to show you, but I mention it because it's different from what I am going to show you, and there are several other methods as well. And so when you're thinking about assessing the business risk of a country, take a look, go search for a variety of methods, because there will be one method that is most comfortable for you to use. This one was done by some of my students, and it was based simply on economic analysis. And so you can see that here we've got something that was done back in probably 2016. And it just takes a look at the economic health, in this case of Brazil, and then China. China was looking pretty good at the time. But it's something that you should look at. Okay, critical success factor scorecard. Remember we talked about critical success factors earlier? It's very important to know in an industry what functional capabilities separate winners from losers. Do you remember my discussing that previously? There are one set of criteria called the, oh my, I can't remember the term now, the competitive analysis, competitive advantage, foundation, for lack of a better term. Anyway, efficiency, quality, innovation, and customer responsiveness, according to this author, are the foundations for competitive advantage. And so one of the teams in my classes simply took a look at Toyota based upon those four criteria, and they did a good job. Here's another way of doing a critical success factor analysis, and it was done in the drug industry by another team. I really don't know why we don't have loadings on here, but you can see that what is it, 5 pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Sanofi Aventis, GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, and Merck are placed here. And then this team identified what it believed to be the most important functional capabilities that separated winners from losers. perhaps in this strategic group, because you can see lots of mentioning of specific functions such as cardiology, oncology, immunology, global marketing, patents, low leverage, don't want to be at too great a risk financially. So each of these companies would be rated perhaps from 1 to 5 based on those criteria, and a score would be computed, a total, and we could then compare these companies and decide which of them seems to have the greatest capability functionally uh, to compete in this industry. Now, depending on which firm is doing this analysis, let's say it's Pfizer, and let's say that Pfizer has good scores until we get down to global marketing. Now, frankly, Pfizer does a very good job of global marketing, but let's pretend that it's only got a 2 or a 3. And out here we see that another firm has a 5. So it does a really good job. Well, if Pfizer intends to become more capable, it's obviously going to have to strengthen its global marketing. And a good idea would be to take a look at whichever firm has the 5, or firms for that matter, and take a look at what they do and see if they can adopt some of those methods in order to bridge that gap. And then after that, they might be able to move further. But for the present, if it has a 2 and another firm has a 5, what they'd like to do is get to the same point the other firm does. So this is a critical success factor analysis. Using a scorecard like this can be very helpful. Here's one that takes a look at at consumer beverages and snacks. And it was done by a team that looked at PepsiCo, because PepsiCo makes both carbonated beverages and snacks. Frito-Lay is a brand of PepsiCo. And in this case, weights adding up to 100% were devised to represent the relative importance of these critical success factors. And at that point, then they could rate each one of these companies based upon a scale from 1 to 5, and multiply it by this weighting in order to compute the score for that item and that company. And then when they're added up, they'll be on a 5-point scale. And as you can see, this team thought that PepsiCo did a good job. All right, so at this point, we're going to just pick up the pace a little bit and just step through some industries. And initially, we'll look at a couple that we did, that we looked at in the market analysis lecture. So we won't linger on them. Here's e-commerce. And so the question is e-commerce a market? We looked at its sales here. Or is it an industry? In any event, it's doing pretty well, isn't it? Strong industry. Here it is, e-commerce retail sales as a percent of total sales, so it's also going up. This is clothing, remember that one? So that's an industry as well as a market, isn't it? There's a market for clothing, and there's an industry that manufactures clothing. Any way you look at it, they had a rough second quarter of 2020, and having some difficulty recovering. Here we have food service and drinking places, restaurants, and it's been well publicized how tough it's been for that industry. So There's a market for restaurants, and restaurants, that is food service, is an industry. So you can look at a lot of these things from two perspectives. That's why I'm showing them to you. Here we are with, alcoholic beverages. And again, is it an industry or a market? Grocery stores, the same way. Um, and the retail, cars, the automobile market, and the automobile manufacturing industry. Um, Rather interesting is the way in which the automobile. Sorry about that. That's my telephone telling me who's calling. Um, Anyway, the automobile industry has had a rather interesting evolution. I'm sure you're familiar with it, especially in this part of the United States, because light trucks and SUVs are very popular, whereas regular automobiles, sedans, are not as popular. The red line in this chart is the light truck. The blue line is automobiles. So here we have a chart that shows us the markets for different types of vehicles, but also the way you make a sedan and the way you make a truck is really quite different. And so these are two different. This is similar to that diagram we looked at and saw the difference between generic drugs and proprietary drugs. There's a big difference between autos and light trucks in this industry. Here we have a more straightforward industry diagram showing production of automobiles worldwide right up until last year. And of course, this year, the line would go down even further. So as of 2019, that industry was running into some difficulty. Market shares also differ sharply. As you can see globally, Toyota seems to have, as of 2019, higher market share than Volkswagen, but these are by brands. So for instance, you can see down near the bottom, Chevrolet. That's not General Motors, that's just the Chevrolet brand. Buick and Cadillac are not there, for instance. And in China, General Motors makes some brands of cars that are just made for China. So we've got to be careful. We've got the same problem with Ford up here. So these are interesting bar charts, but and they're important because brands are important, but they may not tell the whole story about corporations. So here, in fact, is a chart that shows market shares of 10 automobile companies. And the original chart showed 2000 versus 2017. That was really interesting because this industry has changed a lot. On the other hand, I was able to go find market shares for 2019. And I think one of the things that we can get from this chart is that competitive conditions worldwide in this industry are really changing. Toyota has maintained a really strong position. One thing you might notice is that General Motors is really picking up the pace. It has withdrawn from a number of countries where profit potentials are not good. So it's done the kind of things that we talked about earlier with Porter's five forces and Porter's yeah, is global model. Um, I'm sorry, I can't think of it now, but it's the one that compares countries' potential to support industries. So General Motors has done a lot of that kind of analysis, and lo and behold, its market share has really popped up. It was almost 14%. By 2017, it had dropped down to 7%, and last year in 2019, 12%. I think that based upon the tough situation in China and the strains between the US and China today, that GM's market share in China probably has dropped below 12% again. But you can see how these ranks have changed dramatically. At one point, General Motors was ranked #1. Then by 2017, #4, and so forth. You may have noticed the stars here. Have you figured out what these stars indicate? Each one of these is an Asian country: Japan, Korea, Japan, but not the U.S. There are General Motors and Ford. Volkswagen, of course, is Germany. And these down at the bottom are also European. So we have kind of a world war going on between Japan and Asia, Europe, and the United States. What's not on this chart are auto companies that are unique to China. Chinese auto companies that just sell their products in China. Eventually, they'll sell them outside of China, but they're not reflected here, and they're growing. Here we have, in fact, market shares for countries between 2000 and 2018. And lo and behold, you can see that whereas in 2000, China was the 8th largest producer of cars in the world with only 3.5%. By 2018, it had 29% and was the largest manufacturer of cars in the world, followed by the United States and then Japan. Notice, by the way, India in the #4 position here. We'll deal with that a bit later. Here's another way of looking at this same information, and it just was an easy chart to look at, so I threw it in here. But here we have the 10 largest markets, and not necessarily production. Again, China the largest, US second largest, Japan third largest. But here again is India, which is one of the 5 largest markets for cars now. But you got to be careful. What exactly is a car? Here's the fastest selling car in India. So now you can appreciate that pricing, culture, economic differences really do come into play. In India, people generally can't afford the kind of car that is the usual product in the United States, but they still need mechanized transportation. And this is a very popular version of mechanized transportation in India. And there are 2 or 3 of these manufacturers that produce these vehicles. If you own one of these in India, you're doing pretty well if you can afford one. So here then is a chart that compares just cars, just sedans. And you can see that the orange line is China, and it's just pulling away from the rest of the world. This chart shows the global production of cars through 2019. By the way, this is a standardized scale. 2015 is equivalent to 100 on this scale. And you can see that the red dotted line represents auto production in China. And it grew faster than the rest of the world, primarily because during the financial crisis and meltdown in 2008, 9, and 10, China's auto production kept going. Here's a chart that the Chinese love to show. Again, it's a standardized scale. You can see it begins at 100, but here the blue line is global auto production, and you see it doesn't grow very much. But that's without China. With China, you have the dotted red line, and you can see there's been some growth. And then China's auto production all by itself, and you can see that it's been the growth, the driver of the auto industry for some time. Although the last couple of years, China's auto production has dropped. And here is a way of looking at auto production differences between parts of the world. The purple bars are China and elsewhere in Asia, but you can see that they're growing pretty rapidly, and market shares are for all of Asia are pretty high. Japan and China are both there, so no surprise. On the other hand, if we look at the red bar, North America, we can see that things are not doing too well, nor are they doing very well in Europe, the blue bar. Latin America is almost inconsequential. So the auto industry is doing pretty well, but because of the COVID situation and people staying at home, working at home, the gasoline station sales aren't doing that well. We'll just take a look at some other industrial trends. Here we see industrial capacity utilization in the United States through this year. No surprise, really down. So in a situation like that, doing those analyses that we looked at earlier are very important because there's a real premium on identifying the targets of opportunity where there is some profit potential. Here we have all manufacturing in the United States. It dropped, it's recovering, but it hasn't fully recovered yet. Here we have computing, hardware and software, and the red line is software. And I think you're already aware that the social media and the internet have been extremely important, video conferencing and so forth, to all of us as we've had to stay home and work from home. Here's the way the housing industry is shaping up. And we talk about this in the marketing lecture, so it shouldn't be a surprise to you. But the red portion of this diagram consists of multifamily units under construction. And you can see that that's where the largest growth in the residential construction industry has been. And as we go forward, it looks like that gap is going to widen quite a bit more. So here, if you're an industry analyst, you'd be, or for that matter, a financial analyst, and you're looking for places to make good investments, I would think that construction of multifamily buildings would be a pretty attractive industry. And we talked about reasons for that in the market analysis lecture, so I won't bore you with that now. Something else that we talked about, well, I guess really this is the same thing, isn't it? And that is the difference between single family and multifamily buildings, and the percentage of single family and multifamily. And it looks like I've gotten my table mixed up a bit, but long story short, we start out with single family percentage at about 50%, and by the time 2012 came around, it was down to 29%. So this table, when it's done right, would indicate that the portion of single and multifamily housing unit demand shifted drastically and in the direction of multifamily units. And perhaps, oh, there we go. Okay, whoops. I've got to fix this chart, don't I? So here we are down to 2009, and boy, the chart is simply wanting. But we're down to about a third of housing units are now single family, whereas previously they were about half. And that was 2 decades ago. But by last year, only a third of housing units were for single families. 2/3 were for multiple families. And here we can see in a line chart that same progression. And you can see the blue line, which is total family structures, going up at a good clip, and single family sort of flattening out, and the gap between the two widening. And again, here, I probably should just get rid of that prior chart, because here we have the same information done nice and neat. So please pardon me for the prior exhibit. Here is the investment in non-residential structures, that is office buildings and industrial facilities. And it looks like that's holding its own. Although in 2020, I'm sure that it dropped because industrial capacity utilization is not that high today. Here is the trend in sources of electric power. And you can see the brown line reflects coal. And the amount of coal, electricity generated by coal is really dropping. And the amount generated from natural gas is really rising. But the green line down here is from renewables, largely solar. So we've got two growth trends going here. Natural gas, because there's so much of it available, and because the supply exceeds demand, pricing is really down. On the other hand, we've got this continuous growth in demand for primarily solar energy. So these are all our separate industries. By the way, when we were talking about Porter's 5 forces, you can see the substitution going on here between coal-fired electric plants, natural gas-fired plants, and solar power. Here we see liquid fuels, that is oil, and their production and consumption. And you can see that the production kept on going even after consumption dropped. And the result was a large buildup of inventory that is still with us today. And because there's so much supply, prices are relatively low. So the line on the bottom here represents crude oil production. You can see how it's dropped during the pandemic and expected to come up. The dotted line is expected. And the geographic sources are over here on the right. Not for this purposes of this discussion, what's most important is that you can see this drop at the end of 2019 and 2020. The drop has really been something spectacular. And by the way, you can see that this information is from the US Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration, and this information is very reliable. Here we see the surplus of crude oil that is built up as a result of what I just discussed earlier. And it's really built up this year in 2020. Here, on the other hand, is the production of coal. And no surprise, coal is considered to be a dirty fuel, and its production has really dropped. However, it's expected to pick up again. This is just in the United States. And there are still some utility, electric power plants that are powered by coal. But some of this production is being shipped to other countries. In India, they're still building power plants that use coal. They are coal-fired electric power plants. So here's the consumption of coal in the United States. It's just the flip side of what we looked at a minute ago. And now we're off to another industry, but I think we've looked at a couple industries now: automobiles and electric power and fuel. And you can imagine how important it is to do a really good analysis of an industry and its components when we're in the volatile changing times that we are. Here's another industry that's been really impacted by the coronavirus, the global airline industry, and the cargo versus passenger revenues. And you can just see what the dip in passenger revenues has been. It's really been horrible for that industry. Here's what's been going on in the United States steel industry. And again, why is that? Well, more steel goes into more than just cars. For instance, steel beams are used in construction. And we know that construction of commercial buildings, industrial buildings, multifamily residential buildings are all consumers of large, what's the word I'm looking for? Steel beams, I guess. In any event, whether it's due to automobile construction commercial buildings construction, and the demand for steel has really dropped. You can see that capacity utilization at the lowest point here in 2020 was about 50% of the steel industry's capacity was utilized. If you're not at 80%, it's very difficult to make a profit. And you can see that this industry has had a hard time getting over 80%. Here's the share of steel production around the world. And lo and behold, there's China in 2018 and 2019, accounting for more than half of the world's steel production. Why is that? The answer is because China's economy is growing. And when it's growing, it's building bridges for highway construction. It's building commercial buildings, residential buildings, industrial buildings. It's making a lot of machinery and so forth from steel. I think I've probably mentioned during this series of videos that I recently visited several cities in China, and that the national bird of China is the crane. And that's a joke that people who visit China often use, because everywhere you go, you see cranes involved in building things. So steel consumption tends to parallel economic growth. And that's exactly what you see here. Okay, farm income, oh my. And this, by the way, is the United States farm income before subsidies. And it's standardized so that 2019 is equivalent to is the base for these calculations. And again, I've got a little problem with my table over here, but crops are on the top, animals are on the bottom. But you can see that farm income in recent years has not been generous to the farmer due to pricing, high yields and so forth, and more recently due to strains in relationships between Russia and China and the United States. The US farm industry used to, and still does, ship quite a lot to China and Russia, but not as much as in the past. And here's a rather interesting chart, and it shows here again, this is sort of like that chart that compared the generic drugs to proprietary drugs. In this case, it's food consumed at home and food service in retail establishments, including restaurants and bars. And the black line is the commercial establishment. You can see what happened to food service there as opposed to food service at home, which is the red line. It's not food service, but rather groceries consumed at home. But what a difference in consumption of foods in the United States. Now for the last industry, and I'll try to make this as quick as possible, but if you're watching this video because you're a student, this last one may be of interest to you. Here's the effect of the COVID on electronic learning, online learning. The red line is fully online. The black line is a blend of online and in the classroom. But you can see that there's been a big increase in online and partially online learning. Here's a way of looking at it a little more simply, what portion of students are taking at least one online class? What portion are taking no online courses? And you can see how drastically that has dropped, and how drastically from 20% to 50%, at least one online course. And even the blue line that shows the portion of students that are taking only online, that still is not the majority, but it's rising. Um, this is a graph from the European Union, and I confess that although I'm bringing it to you, there's a part of it that I don't understand. We can see, and this is all 28 countries in the European Union. The dark blue line is simply the portion of students taking online courses. It's up to 15%. That's surprisingly low. And then we have the dotted line of all individuals. So I guess that's people taking courses, but perhaps not for academic credit. I'm not sure what that dotted line means. Here is an issue that US universities and colleges are really grappling with, and that is the issuance of student visas. And another way to say it is the enrollment of foreign students in American colleges and universities. And you can see that in the past few years, it's really dropped starkly. Partly that's because the relationship between China and the US has been so strained. And so you can see the black part of these bars was pretty high, and then it shrunk sharply. But we can see that the blue bars also have come down, and that's everywhere but China. Now, a number of these folks are from India, and I think there's an exhibit where we'll see that. But to the extent that we've got this drop, this has a big impact on enrollment in American and European colleges and universities. So the chart on the left here shows the countries that have been sending students to the United States, and the top line here is China. And so it's made the largest contribution. On the other hand, the trends in the enrollment and the percent changes are really dropping. The blue line here is the rate of change, and the green line, like this one over here, is total enrollment. But you can see that the percent change has really dropped. Another factor in this industry, the education industry, is simply enrollment. And enrollment has dropped sharply in recent years, but that's mainly due to the decline in these institutions that are for profit, like Phoenix University. But what also has happened is that the portion of student loans has really picked up. Peak enrollment occurred here in 2011, but the amount of student loans continues to climb. As a result of what we looked at here, with the loss of foreign students, and also the high cost of education, lo and behold, we can see that the closures of colleges in the United States are increasing. And this year, during the coronavirus, I would expect that we'll see even more. But in the 2016 to 17 year, 178 educational institutions closed. And I imagine that if this were last year, there would be even more, and certainly in 2020. So this is a real issue. And so the last slide that I'm going to show you is this quote from a Wall Street Journal article that talks about perhaps 200 schools will close this year, and that compares to 178. So this is a serious issue for American education and American educational institutions. So that's it. We have completed this video lecture on industry analysis. We started out by looking at some methods of industry analysis using models given to us by experts such as Michael Porter. And then we took a look at some actual examples, such as the automotive industry, the petroleum industry, and lastly, the education industry. To understand what's going on in situations that are changing as dramatically as those industries are as a result of the pandemic, but also as a result of changes in relations between China and the United States, for instance. We really need those industry analytic devices that I showed you in the first half of this lecture. So become familiar with them. Only one or two of them are in your textbook. But if you intend to be in a management position of a corporation, if you intend to take on greater responsibility as a manager in your career, then you're going to need these models, and you're going to need to be able to look at and appreciate the changes in the industry or industries that your company or corporation is involved in by looking at the big picture and analyzing them the way that we have in this video. So if you're anticipating an industrial career, I hope that this video has given you some tools to be more productive in your career. And for that matter, I hope that this series of long videos on the economy, market, and industry has made you a better strategic analyst. And with that, I will try to find the appropriate button to say goodbye. It's hard for me to find these buttons. Goodbye.